So just letting you know that it's being recorded. I haven't figured out a way to turn that off. So getting everybody just a minute or two here to settle in. Hi, everybody. Daniel and I were just talking in the background. Dean Nelson is going to be joining us for the conversation, but he's having a little bit of internet issues. So we're gonna fill a little bit of airtime, see if and when Dean pops in, but Daniel and I will talk for a few minutes as we get started. And then when Dean pops in, he'll continue the conversation. So again, welcome everyone. I think that for most of you who are joining us, you have somehow found Warwick's and Warwick's website. So you know at least what our website is, because that's how you got the link to get in here. But in case you're unfamiliar of where we're located, Warwick's is located in San Diego, La Jolla, California. Daniel, you've been to the store, haven't you, for an event?
I have, and there's a wonderful taco place a couple blocks over from
Puesto.
Yes, I wish I was there tonight.
Yes, and every author that comes seems to find Puesto. They will be glad to know that. So, so if you, and some of you have already purchased the book for the event tonight, and just want to let you know that we will be processing and shipping those books to you tomorrow. Or you can come by the store and pick those up from us. But tonight I'll also be putting that link into the chat function so that you can easily click on that. You have two options when you do that. You can have it shipped to you, or if you're in the San Diego, La Jolla area, we would love for you to come in the store. There's absolutely nothing better than coming into Warwick's and shopping all the books. The other side's full of wonderful gifts and jewelry and lots of good Father's Day stuff, speaking of, which this book would make a fantastic Father's Day gift. So keep that in mind while you're watching tonight. But also Warwick's has wonderful fine pens and leather and lots of good Father's Day stuff. So if you are in the area, we would love to see you. My little sign says there, some of you have been to a lot of my events. You're probably tired of hearing this, but it does say 1896. We are celebrating our 125th anniversary this year. Yeah, 125 years, right, Daniel?
Wow.
Talk about history. And talk about what Warwick's has lived through.
Yeah.
You know, couple of pandemics, couple world wars. We were going through the archives, and one of them, which I think, and for you that come to these a lot, sorry you hear this story, but the one that I love is they found an article that was written by the La Jolla paper that or I think it was La Jolla paper at the time, that because we've been in the business has been in La Jolla since the 30s. So we've been a San Diego institution for quite a while. But they were worried about books when television was invented, because they didn't think anybody was going to read when television came.
Really?
So,
wow.
So lots of things we lived through. So Dean's still not with us. He will hopefully be showing up soon when he gets his internet working out, but I'm going to introduce Daniel to you, and then we'll chat for a few minutes until Dean can pop in and join us. So quick intro here about Daniel. I think all of you know who he is, but I have to do my due diligence and do the official intro here. So, and I want to thank his publisher for allowing us to host this tonight. Y'all are very lucky to be here and listening to this. I think it's going to be wonderful. So Daniel James Brown is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of The Boys in the Boat, The Different Stars Above, and Under a Flaming Sky. He lives outside of Seattle with his wife, 2 daughters, and an assortment of cats, dogs, chicken, and honeybees. Although he's joining us today from, would you say Carmel?
I'm in Carmel, California today.
Yeah. Beautiful. So not too far up the coast there. It's beautiful up there. When he's not writing, he is likely to be birding, gardening, fly fishing, reading American history, or chasing bears away from the beehives. That has to be a little dangerous. He's here today to talk to us about his latest book, Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II. So welcome, Daniel, back to Warwick's.
Thank you for having me. As I say, I wish I was there so I could meet people in person and also get some tacos.
Yeah, exactly. Virtual Warwick's. So for those of you that are watching this, Dean was supposed to do this, so I'm winging it right now. So no like booing the interviewer here. So the first question that I always, want to ask and want to know about is, so Boys in the Boat was, fantastic. What was the precipice for this book, and how many years were you researching it?
Yeah, so this one started actually in 2015. So 5.5 years ago, I think. I met a guy in Seattle named Tom Ikeda, and Tom has spent the last 25 years of his life videotaping, reco- recording, archiving, and making available to the public on a website. The oral histories of Japanese Americans, particularly folks that lived through the World War II years. And I met Tom. We were actually both at an awards ceremony, and he explained what he did. I went home, and I think it was that night I sat down and I went to densho.org, which is where all these oral histories are available. And I just started listening to some of these firsthand accounts. And I was just mesmerized. I spent several days listening to people's stories, and I was just mesmerized by them. They were obviously all by Japanese Americans or their Japanese immigrant parents. But they were also all kinds of stories that I'm sort of naturally drawn to. They were stories about what were then young Americans trying to make their way in the world, um, encountering really difficult situations and obstacles that they had to overcome, particularly with the beginning of World War II, and getting through those troubles through just sort of sheer perseverance and courage and tenacity. It's in that sense, it's a little like Boys in the Boat. I'm always drawn to stories of ordinary Americans of that generation, especially.
And the
Having,
people that you talk to, how were they notified? How did they come to, like, what was that process of knowing that this was, or how do they even know that it was going to be happening?
the book.
The not the book, the what happened to them personally with, like,
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean that was, of course, part of the trauma for Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. There were a lot of traumas all at once, but one of them was that word began to circulate in the community actually before it happened, that they might all be rounded up and forced from their homes, and
so it's
made
just
to
sort of
give.
a rumor thing, kind of
It
a
was just a
rumor.
rumor thing first. And then, of course, it was like February 19th, 1942, that the Roosevelt administration issued this executive order that actually put into place the process that would actually lead to people being forced from their homes and incarcerated in these camps. So first there was fear, and there was a lot of fear within the community about what was going to happen. Some people feared even worse things. Some people were fearful about violence directed at them after Pearl Harbor. Um, but pretty early on, people began to understand that the government was contemplating rounding people up and incarcerating them.
And
So that,
did people feel that, did some leave? Did some of these people that you talked to, did some of their families leave the country?
yeah, so what happened was the executive order actually created an exclusion zone along the West Coast. So from the Canadian border down to San Diego, where you are, and a little bit over into Arizona, um, this zone was created from which anybody of Japanese ancestry, American citizen or not, had to leave, had to be forced out. The rest of the country, they could technically go to other parts of the country. The problem was, as a practical matter, almost none of these families had the resources to pick up and move to uh, Iowa City or someplace. It just
Or even
wasn't,
go back to Japan? I mean,
or go
could they have
back.
gone back to Japan?
Not at that point. At that point, for some of the older people were actually Japanese citizens. There was a process by which they could be repatriated, but that took years actually to, to, to take place. But most of these folks, the Japanese Americans, as a practical matter, they didn't have any choice but to get on the buses with whatever they could carry, and and go off first to these assembly centers, they called them, which were mostly just fairgrounds where people had to sleep in horse stalls and all kinds of things. And then as they got constructed, they were sent on to these 10 camps scattered around the American West, where almost all of them wound up living the war years surrounded by barbed wire.
And did they, they were obviously like got notification or somehow, some way to report to these camps. But if they didn't, did the police come?
Yes. So yes, this was a military order. And so virtually nobody actually initially resisted. One of the characters in my book did. And if you don't mind, let me just talk about him for a moment, because he's a particularly interesting character. And some folks may have heard of him because his case wound up going up to the Supreme Court. Gordon Hirabayashi was a student at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the first thing that happened in Seattle was an 8 p.m. curfew was put in place on anybody of Japanese ancestry, American or not. They couldn't be out on the streets after 8 p.m. Gordon decided early on, he was a very principled young man. He believed very strongly in the American Constitution. So he decided, well, I'm not going to obey this curfew. This is racially motivated. And so he began deliberately staying out after 8 p.m. in the evenings. And in fact, keeping a journal, noting, documenting when he was staying out. And then when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to be put on buses and taken away to these assembly centers, Gordon just didn't do it. He just didn't get on the bus. Instead, he sat down and he wrote out this very articulate, carefully reasoned statement saying why he believed that both the curfew and the incarceration in the camps were illegal and unconstitutional. And then he took that statement and he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI offices in downtown Seattle. And he handed the statement to the agent on duty there and turned himself in. And the FBI office agents in Seattle didn't know what to do with Gordon. Nobody else had done this. And so it took days. They finally put him in the King County jail. And he spent the rest of the war in and out of different jails and prisons as he fought his legal case all the way up to the Supreme Court. So as I say, there were a relatively few people originally who actively resisted, but there were some like Gordon.
Yeah, and so your book, the book that you wrote about, because we live here in California, and Manzanita I think is the place in California. So, but your book is about which camp? Is it about a certain camp, or is it just about different stories of different?
Well, so what I did was when I was looking at all those oral histories at the Densho archive, I realized I don't want to write a comprehensive history of Japanese Americans. It would be really presumptuous for me to do that, for one thing. And it's not what I do. What I do is I take personal stories that shed some light on a piece of history that is interesting. So I needed to narrow the focus down to just a few individuals. So what I did is I focused on 4 young men of draft age and what they did right after Pearl Harbor, because young men of draft age had a particular dilemma. Their classmates, their friends were all going off to enlist in the military. Many of them wanted to do the same, but when they went to the Selective Service Office, they were told they couldn't enlist. They were enemy aliens. And so some wanted to enlist and serve, others wanted to resist the whole thing on principle. So I picked 4 individual young men, and the book weaves together their stories and how they made their way through the war years. One of those young men was a guy named Rudy Tokiwa, who grew up near where I am today in Salinas, California. And Rudy's family was incarcerated at a place called Post in Arizona, one of the hottest and bleakest of these camps. And so I focused mostly on that camp, which in many ways was there were 10 of these camps all told. Poston was one of the hottest and most miserable, but I focus on it because that's where one of my 4 characters was incarcerated, and he actually wound up volunteering for the military. A year after Pearl Harbor, the Roosevelt administration reversed course and decided they would, after initially refusing to let Japanese Americans serve, they decided they in fact would allow them to serve. So Rudy was one of these young men that came out from behind the barbed wire to enlist in what became an all Japanese American fighting unit. And then he went on and fought in Europe.
Boy, that must have been something to that's just from a cultural standpoint, you're Japanese, but he
Yeah.
fought. So did that regiment fight in the Pacific, or you said they went to Europe? Do you?
So it was called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And it was, as I say, all Japanese American, except a lot of the officers were white. They fought only in Europe.
Okay.
There were some young Japanese American men, if they scored very high on aptitude tests, and if they had very good Japanese language skills. A lot of them had grown up in households where Japanese was spoken. If they spoke really good Japanese and they scored high enough on an aptitude test, they were actually pulled out of the 442nd and put into the military intelligence service. And they spent the war in the Pacific theater, mostly behind the lines, listening in on Japanese communications. Interpreting, but a fair number of them actually served on the ground with US troops in the Philippines and places like that, because they could interrogate prisoners. So as Japanese prisoners were brought in, these guys could speak to them and could interrogate them. So a relatively small number of people served in the Pacific, but virtually everybody else served in Europe.
In Europe, yeah. So the four stories that you tell, did their families, okay, so they were either California or Seattle or somewhere up the Pacific coast is where these 4 gentlemen were. So I don't want to give away, I don't too much of the story, but did their families afterwards, when they were liberated, what happened in that whole scenario?
After the war?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I wish I could say, first I should say that the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had an extraordinary battle record. They wound up actually being the most decorated American military unit of its size and length of service, not just in World War II, but in American military history. They had a very high casualty rate, but they also had many, many, many decorations. They were very heavily decorated because of their extreme valor. So they came back, many of them genuine war heroes, with medals hanging on their chests. And it would be nice to say that they were, greeted warmly. And I mean, some were, I don't want to overgeneralize, but as a rule, for the most part, unfortunately, these young men came back to the West Coast after the war at about the same time that their families were being released from these camps. They were also coming back to San Diego or LA or Seattle or wherever. By and large, they met the same kind of sort of vicious racial stereotyping and anger that had been in their communities when they were taken out of them at the beginning of the war. So over time, I think what the 442nd did help improve the situation for Japanese Americans, but it took decades for that to unfold. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was still a lot of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence.
Thomas, and I want to tell the audience who's watching too, Thomas put a question into the Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to pop those into the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen, and I'll bring those in because, like I said, we're kind of winging it here tonight. So, so Thomas's question is the 442nd was an All-American Japanese suicide mission in Italy, and he's curious if you address that in your book.
Yeah, so there were actually several missions that that might be characterized that way. They were often put into, because of their extreme valor, they were often put into some of the most dangerous, given some of the most dangerous missions. I think the one that he may be referring to, maybe, well, there was one in Italy, but probably the more famous one was on the French-German border. A group of Texas soldiers had been ordered to go too far into the Vosges forest right on the German border. They'd been cut off and surrounded by German troops on the top of a mountain, basically. And many of them were wounded, they had gangrene, they began to die, they had no food, they had no medical supplies, no drinkable water. The commanding general, General Dahlquist, sent a number of other Texas units up that mountain to try to get to them. None of them could get through. And finally, he sent the all Japanese American 442nd up that mountain. And it was just absolutely devastating for them. The two of the guys I write about were in K Company, which was the lead company going up that mountain. And I think at the beginning of the sequence of battles that led up to that, there were 180 men in K Company. By the time they finally came down after this mission, came down off the mountain, there were only 17 of them that were still walking. So it was all but a suicide mission, but they did accomplish their goal.
Yeah, Thomas says thank you. His uncle is where Italy is where his uncle was wounded. His last name is Koto. So
there were also some very hairy battles in Italy, and they took very heavy casualties in Italy as well.
Yeah. So Facing the Mountain, the title of the book, where did that come from?
It came from my wife. I'm terrible with titles. My agent and my editor give up on me as far as title. I always come up with these very, very flowery metaphorical titles that have. Actually, this one is a little metaphorical. So basically, this book is centered, as I said earlier, on this sort of mountain of troubles that arose in the path of Japanese Americans on the day of Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, that morning, they were going about their business. Their immigrant parents were running their laundries or their nurseries or the farm they were working. The young Americans where their children were either helping on the farm or going to UCLA or living pretty ordinary American middle-class lives for the most part. And instantaneously, beginning on December 7th of that year, all that changed in an instant. And there was this mountain of troubles that they had to find a way over or through or around. So it's sort of a metaphor for that central concern of the book. And then there's also another level on which it works, which is that for the military part of it, these 442 guys, and there was also a unit called the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was also all Japanese American. Both those units, as a practical matter, both in Italy and on the French-German border, they were always fighting their way up the side of some mountain. The Germans always had the high ground. They were always fighting up the mountain in the face of machine guns and tanks and things that were aimed down at them. So it also just sort of fit topographically with the reality of what the soldiers in the book went through.
Of what they went through, yeah. So back to the four. So you talked about two. In comparing this with Boys in the Boat, and what people get out of both of the books, and the reaction obviously was fantastic. Boys in the Boat is just an iconic book. what do you want people to take away from this story and from these
Yeah.
stories?
So in some ways, on one level, some of the same things as I say, I'm a big admirer of that generation of Americans and how resilient they were, and also just the magnitude of the problems that they faced. We have plenty of problems, God knows, but the World War II generation, the Depression generation, they got through some really tough times. And so I think both these books celebrate that. This one, obviously, because all these young men and their families are Japanese or Japanese American, has a racial component to it, and it's partly about racism, institutionalized racism, and I think readers will come away with a deeper appreciation of the contributions that, in this case, Japanese Americans have made, both the immigrant parents and their American children and subsequent generations. I mean, my hope is that it makes it personal. If you get to know these four young men, now very old, well, they've all passed away now, but at the time they left their stories, they were old men. If you get to know these four young men and their families on a personal level, which is what I'm trying to do in the book, kind of like I hope people got to know Joe Rance and the others in Boys in the Boat, then the history starts meaning more. I mean, it did for me as I met them and I met their family members. It helped the history come alive for me. So my hope is that it helps the history come alive. And my particular hope is that it helps a little bit, at least, with this most recent wave of anti-Asian sentiment that we're going through. Again, when you realize what these families have contributed to the country, it makes it all the more obvious how unnecessary and how wrong the racial bigotry is.
Right. Well, and I was going to lead to that because, first of all, they truly are the greatest generation. I mean, I don't think that we have the stomach to do what that generation did. Yeah. I mean, they truly were, and just in so many levels. And we were talking earlier before we started about another author who wrote about the Dust Bowl and what those women in the 30s, was a story about a woman, but it was just like, yeah. I look back at like my grandmother and my grandfathers, and it's just like they were, and my father, those were some gritty, like really, they survived some pretty harrowing that we think we have it so tough. It's like, oh, we are so soft.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are so soft. But I was wondering what, if you were going to, the parallel to what's happening now with the, it's, and what does it mean to be an American?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, so, I thought I knew a lot about, I grew up in California. I've always had lots of Asian friends, and I thought I knew a lot about the sort of history of anti-Asian bias, particularly in California, where I grew up. But I realized this story is a lot more complicated than that. The story of these camps is a lot more complicated. I learned so much from talking to family members and doing the basic research. I'm sorry, I sort of lost the thread of your.
Yeah, I was just commenting about. I even lost what my thread was. I think I don't know.
Well, it just. I think the thing that has stuck with me is, although I thought.
Oh, what it is to be an American. That was where we were going.
I realized by doing the research on this book, by getting to know the families, talking to the people, but also just doing basic research into the history of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence in this country, I realized how deep and how old it is. It really goes back to the gold rush in the 1849 and 50s, when Chinese immigrants came to California in large numbers. They were met with tremendous violence. There were lynchings and beatings and burnings, and people were driven from their homes. And then a few decades later, this this notion of the yellow peril arose in the media, in newspapers, and a little later in Hollywood, where Asians were equated with insects and locusts and snakes and vermins and rats, and all these racial stereotypes and tropes were sort of built into the American consciousness.
Right.
So when Pearl Harbor happened, that was already all there. And so it could be weaponized just,
Really quickly.
in a moment and directed against Americans who happen to be of Japanese descent. The imagery, the phrases, the ideas were already there. And so when I was researching Pearl Harbor and the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, that became really obvious to me. And what's become obvious to me in the more recent past, very recent past, is that those things are still there. Those ideas and those associations with disease and plague and things like that. Guess what? They can just be brought up and weaponized in an instant because they're sort of already there. So that was sort of a big takeaway for me in terms of my own learning.
Right. And that is something that is so dangerous and just so, and it has to be heartbreaking too, as you're researching, because it's like this happened, like we were saying before this started, this didn't happen that many years ago. I mean,
yeah, it really wasn't, I grew up in the shadow of this. I think I was telling you beforehand, my father was in the flower business in San Francisco. And so probably 30 or 40% of our customers when I was growing up were Japanese American florists and nurserymen. And my father was a very gentle, soft-spoken man, almost never got visibly angry. One of the very few times I remember him being visibly angry was when he started talking once about what had happened to his Japanese American friends. They came back out of the camps. They came back to greenhouses that had been shattered and land that had been taken out from under them and businesses that they could no longer reestablish because customers had gone elsewhere. And it was, as I say, one of these very few things that would just make my father livid. So yeah, I had a certain awareness of it growing up.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of talk about reparations in the African American community and things that were taken, the Tulsa, that part of history that some of us weren't aware of, and shame on us for not being aware of it, that was happening. Yeah. But the Tulsa, the Wall Street that they had a whole, and you can't recreate that. And sort of the same thing with these businesses and these livelihoods. You can't, there's no reparation for that.
Yeah. So, as a practical matter, there was no way in many cases and it was very hard on the Issei generation, the immigrant generation that had spent in many cases 20, 30, 40 years building these businesses up and by now they're in their 60s or 70s. As a practical matter, they couldn't reestablish those.
Right. And what lost wealth there was from that. I mean,
and there was an enormous loss of wealth. I mean, whole families were wiped out financially. There actually was reparations decades later. It was interesting. Another thing I learned in researching the book was that by the 1980s, this was led largely by 442 vets. They began to lobby, literally walking the halls of Congress, to lobby for an apology from the United States and for reparations for the people who had been incarcerated. And it took decades, and it took, part of what happened is a number of Japanese American veterans went into politics, became very influential politicians in Hawaii and on the mainland. But finally, eventually, actually reparations, $20,000 was paid to each person who was incarcerated. But that didn't begin to cover what they had lost 30 years before.
Right, what they had lost and what that wealth would have been had they been able to continue those businesses.
Yeah. I mean, if they'd been able to get $20,000 in 1945 and reopen that flower shop or that laundry or whatever,
right,
that that might have made a difference.
Right. And their families could have had familial generational wealth growing those businesses.
Exactly. So it was
Yeah.
largely symbolic, but
Right.
it did finally happen.
We got another question here from Mark. He says, I believe Congressman Norm Mineta had a very distinguished battlefield record as well. And also, I believe the internment program was not formulated by Roosevelt, but by who? The internment program.
The internment program was formulated, the program basically was formulated by the American military, who then sold it to Roosevelt. Roosevelt was ambiguous at first. Eleanor Roosevelt was absolutely opposed to it. And even after it went into effect, she spoke out on behalf of the Japanese Americans and went to visit the camps. But it was the War Department, what was then called the War Department, that argued that there was a military necessity, this was their argument, to remove Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast on the theory that some of them might be disloyal and that might lead to sabotage of the defense industry or ports along the West Coast. So it was really it was the military, it was the War Department that after a considerable amount of arguing with the State Department, which opposed it, finally won the day, and Roosevelt wound up signing Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942 that put the whole process into effect.
Wow. How many years were the internment camps? They went through 45, is that?
Yeah, some of them were still open into 45. I mean, towards the end of the war, they began to wind them down. It became overwhelmingly obvious, first of all, the United States was going to ultimately win the war. And second of all, that these people did not pose any threat. So they gradually began to let people out under different conditions from different camps at different times. But some people stayed in. Actually, to tell you the truth, some people were afraid to come home.
Oh.
You know, they had, the hostility against them had been so vicious when they had left wherever, Salinas, just
Right.
I'll say because it's over the mountain here, that they were fearful of coming back into these communities. And so it was another level of trauma actually for a lot of them to come back, both psychologically, but then also, as I said, also in reality, many
Right.
of them did find, as I say, their greenhouses smashed or whatever.
I don't know if you know, how many people were incarcerated interned?
So the number that's usually given is 120,000. It's actually kind of unknown because there was this period where people were coming in and people were leaving, and there were different statuses in the different camps. So it was somewhere between 110,000 and 120,000 people.
Going back to race and own voice kind of things and that thing, how has the Japanese American readership embraced it? What are they saying about your book?
Yeah, that's been very heartening. I mean, I of course was worried about that. I'm obviously not Japanese, of Japanese ancestry. And as I say, I worked very closely with Tom Ikeda, who opened a lot of doors to family members and people in the community. So I've spent a lot of time talking to people about why I was doing this and what I hoped it would accomplish. And people have been hugely supportive, actually, overwhelmingly supportive. And yeah, since the book's come out, I'm really gratified by not just the immediate family members, of course, to the guys I'm writing about, but for all kinds of people from all kinds of levels, including Secretary Mineta and people like that, have been just super supportive of it and really happy with the way it came out. So
I'm glad, because I think that that's important, that there's absolutely a need for own voice stories, but I think there's also room for well done documentation of these things too.
Yeah, well, one of the things, I mean, I told Tom this early on, and I've talked to a lot of people in that community about it, is I knew I would have a large platform for my next book after the success of The Boys in the Boat. And we sort of jointly came to the conviction that that I should use that platform for this cause that I care a lot about and that they care a lot about. And then also, I think it's really important if you look at this book, for people that might be concerned about that. If you look at the sources of this book is built basically 100% on the voices of the people that Tom interviewed for Densho and or the people I interviewed. It's their firsthand accounts of what happened. And all I've done is used whatever skills I have as a storyteller to try to sort of weave some of them together and create an overarching story. So
it's really their stories. You just kind of, you were the puzzle master.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah. I invite everybody again, if you have any questions, we're kind of winding down here, but if you have any other questions, either about this book or Boys in the Boat, go ahead and put those in the Q&A. Need to ask you, Daniel, of course, I mean, I know this book just came out, but everybody always wants to know, what are you working on next?
Oh, I thought you were going to say movie.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that too. If you have any news on that, everybody loves that.
Actually, I do have a little news on that, and really no news on what's next. So I'll go to the movie question.
Okay, go to the movie.
I don't know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to eat some pizza for dinner, actually, next. There is some movement on the movie front, actually, for both The Boys in the Boat and for this book. I might just for a moment digress to The Boys in the Boat. It's been in the press, so I think people know that George Clooney is actually going to direct the film for The Boys in the Boat.
Huge.
And it's it's going to take a while. They're going to start filming. Last I heard, they're going to start filming in April, so almost a year from now before they start filming, because the pandemic set the whole thing back, quite far. But they're gearing up now to start filming that, so that's exciting. And then with the Facing the Mountain book, I've been talking to a director named Destin Daniel Creighton, who is Japanese American. He grew up on Maui. He really is passionate about this story. He just did a movie called Just Mercy, which I think a lot of folks have seen.
That was fantastic.
Wonderful movie about a Black civil rights lawyer and a death penalty case, or a number of death penalty cases. Destin and I have been talking a lot. He makes these wonderfully empathetic films. So we are talking about doing not a feature film, but doing an HBO,
a limited series kind of thing.
Limited series, exactly. Yeah. So
for this book, for Facing the Mountain.
For Facing the Mountain. Now that hasn't been put on paper, but we're making substantial progress towards that. So,
Dean Nelson, do we hate technical issues or what?
I am embarrassed and apologetic, and AT&T sends their regards.
Well, I don't know about Daniel, but I think we had an okay conversation, Daniel.
Yeah, we did fine.
Sorry. Could I just add something to what I just heard? Destin Daniel Creighton is a former student of mine.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he went to Point Loma Nazarene University, where I teach writing and journalism. And in fact, I'm working on a story about him right now before his new Marvel Comics movie comes out. But if you end up working with him, it will be the highlight of your career. And I know that sounds very
even better than George Clooney. Come on, Dean.
I do. I think you're gonna like Destin better than George Clooney, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah. So Julie, I assume we're out of time. I've got 5 pages of questions for Danielle, and so I apologize.
You know what? No, you know what? I'm just going to say one quick thing, because Lori, who is on here, is thanking you for writing this book, Danielle, and bringing awareness to what Japanese and Japanese Americans went through during this time in history. So she thanks you for that. Dean, I can't go without letting you ask at least 1 or 2 of your questions. They might have already been answered, but
Yeah, part of it is I just feel like this is such not just America's story, but a humanity story to immediately find a scapegoat, and then and presume all of these horrible things about a certain kind of person. Conspiracy theories ramp up. We've seen them in our lifetimes. It was obviously true during World War II. And I mean, it's sort of America's story, but it's also the story of humanity to round up people that you might be afraid of and hope that you can address your fear that way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree, and we did talk a little bit about that. In particularly in regards to Asian Americans or Asians in this country, that's history goes, I was saying that history goes back to the first Chinese immigrants that came to California for the gold rush. And it's just been a cycle that has repeated itself over and over in America.
And how do we break that though? I mean, that's the age-old question, right? How do we telling these kind of stories?
One thing, hopefully by humanizing people, I'm obviously my book's not going to end anti-Asian rhetoric in America, but I do think that, personalizing the story, introducing readers to real people so they can see the contributions that people have made, that, that's some kind of an antidote maybe.
But it does seem like we do this, whether it's to Italian Americans or Irish Americans or Muslims or Blacks or fill in the blank. We have a history of doing this, and your book is just so personal, and these characters are just so likable. I honestly. And I'm sorry, Julie, I know I'm dominating here, but
do dominate. You're okay.
I wondered, Daniel, while I was reading this, would I have the fortitude to do what these young people did, which is while their parents are being rounded up and everybody's trying to hide their identity, hide their past to Japan, these folks are lining up to join the forces to be in that while their parents are in concentration camps. Yeah. It made me ask some really hard questions about myself, and I'm not sure I like the answer.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I have asked myself the same question. As I was also saying earlier, I'm drawn to stories like this about ordinary Americans who do things that to me seem extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And, I think that generation taken as a whole, not just Japanese Americans, but Americans in general, they certainly had plenty of faults. But there was kind of, they had an ability to rise to the challenge that, I'm not sure that my generation, I'm baby boomer, right. I'm not sure we as a group have that kind of resilience.
But do you think some of it's cultural too, though? But my husband's half Japanese, and she's from Japan. I think there's a cultural thing to that too, though, don't you think? That the Japanese culture has that.
There definitely was a cultural part of it for some of these young men who decided to enlist. There was, they grew up in families, although they were thoroughly American, they did grow up with Japanese parents and grew up in households often where Japanese was spoken and where there were Japanese icons of various kinds, and they heard stories about the samurai and things as a matter of course. And I know almost universally, one thing that was really striking was as these guys packed up and went off to basic training, almost universally, their fathers took them aside at the last moment at the train station or wherever and said, son, I hope you do well. You have to fight for your country. I hope you come back unwounded. But whatever you do, don't bring shame on the family, which is a very Japanese thing. And I think that, that actually had an effect on the battlefield. These guys were, as I said earlier, always fighting their way uphill against incredible odds. And I think, I'm sure not for all of them, but I think for some of them, that sort of warrior code, although it's sort of foreign to American way of thinking, actually was probably helpful to them on the battlefield.
Yeah, because that thing is a sense of honor and honoring their country, even if as an American, they were fighting for America.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that mountain is such a beautiful metaphor because they were, you've probably already talked about that too. So sorry.
That's okay. Sorry. I feel bad, Dean, because you didn't get any of your answers.
No, Yeah,
That's all right. I was really happy to hear you talk about Destin because, as I say, I've been talking to Destin a lot the last couple of months, and I just have huge admiration for the guy. I'm
yeah.
so excited to work with him.
Yeah, and I mean his Marvel Comics movie is supposed to come out early September, and if you get him for this, I just think this is going to be one of the most beautiful movies and experiences. So I can't wait.
Let's keep our fingers
crossed.
crossed that HBO,
Yeah.
somebody picks HBO, Netflix, somebody. It's all about the money all the time, right, Daniel? Getting the money and getting the
in
right.
the end, yeah, somebody has to agree to spend, tens
Yeah.
of millions of dollars on the thing. But yeah,
But
it's looking good
Well,
right now.
good. All right,
Okay.
Dean, I'm sorry you had technical difficulties.
I am embarrassed and,
Don't be.
I apologize to you all. This is
Let's see, we got
the age.
one more question's coming in here. Oh, we're just getting
The
lots of
age we're
thank
in.
yous. Yes, the
Yeah.
recording will be available. It'll be on our YouTube channel, Thomas. So you'll be able to get this on our YouTube channel. If you want to re-see me filling it, I could never fill your shoes, Dean, but we did our best.
I'm sure you did an admirable job, and I look forward to watching your work once it's on the YouTube channel. Daniel, it's nice to meet you at the beginning and the end of this. Julie, always nice to hang out with you.
Always great hanging out with you, Dean. All right, Daniel,
Great.
good luck. And I know you said there's nothing new coming, but we'll wait. We'll wait for the next inspiration.
Yeah, I have no idea. So I'll be surprised along with you.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyways, yeah, so we answered the movie about there was another question about the books. Yeah, there's a movie for Boys in the Boat is probably with George Clooney starting next year, and then Facing the Mountain hopefully is a limited series. So with that, I'm going to turn off we go away. We don't go back into a green room. So we're saying goodbye to Daniel and Dean right now. And thank you everybody for joining us at the webinar. So have a good evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys.
Bye-bye.
All right,
Bye.
bye-bye.